Hello, everyone. I am delighted to welcome you all today to what promises to be a timely and critical discussion celebrating Susan Sturm's highly relevant and deeply provocative volume, What Might Be: Confronting Racism to Transform Our Institutions, in conversation with one of the legendary leaders in the movement to build full participation for our talented, diverse next generation, Freeman Hrabowski, and moderated by one of the nation's most effective advocates for opportunity in higher education, Ted Mitchell. And speaking of Ted, let me start right off here by thanking Ted and his team at ACE for their partnership in today's event, as well as the supporters of our book series, Princeton University Press and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Earl Lewis and I are so uplifted by the publication of this important volume and the discussion to come today, perhaps especially in these taxing moments of national debate about the very worth of and legal means to achieve what we have argued is nation critical, and why we named our book series, Our Compelling Interests, the Value of Diversity for Democracy in a Prosperous Society. Indeed, as we noted in our introduction to Susan's volume, and I quote, "Everywhere we turn today, we're reminded of the essential paradox of our nation, one literally built on distinctions of race and yet insistent on framing all as one." And as we are confronted now on a daily basis by a nationwide campaign to literally erase history by whitewashing the language of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, we must more than ever remind ourselves and each other of what might be. And indeed, in so many local instances as documented in this volume, what already is. As judges, theater producers, educators, community organizers, public leaders, and other heroic souls confront the paradoxes of working to achieve the value of diversity through full participation in the very institutions that have been built on generations of racism and racial differentiation. As Justice Harry Blackmun poignantly summarized in his opinion in the Bakke case in 1978, and I quote, "In order to get beyond racism, we must first take account of race. There is no other way." That, my friends, is what Susan Sturm's volume does at its heart. And as such, it provides us all with a set of principles and pragmatic steps to keep at this critical work on the ground, in our institutions, in our communities, in our cultural gatherings, recognizing at the same time the nonlinearity of progress, yet committing to the value of collaborative persistence and the degree to which, as the Kerner Commission intoned over 50 years ago at another time of doubt and division, we all do better when we all do better. At the core of our Compelling Interests book series is the recognition on which Susan builds her case for confronting racism. And that is the value and indeed the necessity of achieving full participation for our institutions and organizations and communities to flourish. As Tony Carnevale and Nicole Smith argued in their analysis of the future of the workforce in the very first volume in our series, and as Scott Page demonstrated in his volume on the diversity bonus for innovation in a knowledge economy. Yet at the same time as Susan's thoroughgoing unpacking of the paradoxes to be confronted to reach full participation clearly demonstrates, we all must acknowledge that to do so requires dismantling and redoing the very practices and structures on which so much has depended. What Gary Orfield calls the walls around opportunity in his volume's analysis of the failures of colorblind policies in higher education. Indeed, confronting the sequelae and the contemporary impact of structural racism built up in our institutions over generations requires, as Susan frames it, and I quote, embracing anti-racism's contradictions, which is particularly challenging, both she and I would argue, when leadership of these institutions rarely reflects the diversity of the talent available to us in our own backyards. Susan unpacks in her analysis of effective anti-racism work three paradoxes that I'm sure will be discussed today, but let me just warm up that discussion by quoting from her treatise. First, and especially relevant in a world where power is rarely afforded equitably, is the paradox of racialized power. And I quote, anti-racism requires white people to lean into their power to make change while stepping back from exercising power in order to make space for people of color to lead. Yet we can't erase the. Am I being silenced? All too well. We need to all get on board with the collective value, yet we can't erase the obvious inequities, as many in our world today would prefer. And third is the question of whether we do this work as insiders or outsiders to our institutions and their power structures, the paradox of racialized institutions. And I quote Susan, predominantly white institutions must undertake anti-racism work while simultaneously being the target of it. To all of us in this room who have tried to be change agents for equity and progress, this is work, inevitably replete with missteps, and most of all, it requires reaching outside ourselves, our practices, our statuses, our reward structures, doing, for example, the kind of intergroup stretch work that Eboo Patel describes in his volume in our series, Out of Many Faiths, Religious Diversity, and the American Promise, looking, as his commentator, John Anuzu, notes, for common ground, even amidst disagreements about the common good. Looking, as Susan outlines in her volume, to reframe our interests in terms of our linked fate. Yes, this is all very hard work. And as Susan and her late dear friend and colleague, Lonnie Guinier, to whom this book is dedicated, so passionately, incisively have said throughout the decades of their work together, and as Earl and I wrote in the introduction to this wonderful volume, and I quote, finding common ground in the ever-fraught territory of racial justice work is never going to be easy, especially as it requires crossing the boundaries of the highly segregated lives we all inherited. Nonetheless, we must learn to do it, and this book will take us well on that journey, reminding us at the same time that we won't get it all right ourselves. And that is why the educators in this room must keep on pressing for greater representation of the diverse lived experiences of the next generation who may be able to better lead our institutions, organizations, communities, corporations, and public agencies. We need that fresh talent, and they in turn need to see a road to effective leadership and change. And that's why we're so thrilled with Susan Sturm's book, and so look forward to hearing this eminent threesome unpack the stories that inspire us all to keep at it, even amidst a tricky landscape. But then again, this work was never going to be easy. So let's hear now from those who have persisted in paving the way. And we're so fortunate to have as a moderator for today's discussion someone who has been a leader in higher education advocacy and transformation for so many decades. Ted Mitchell has served as president of the American Council on Education, the major coordinating body for the nation's colleges and universities, since September 2017. He and his team work closely with Congress when they can, the executive branch when they can, and the private sector to develop policies and innovative practices that serve our country's post-secondary learners. Ted's leadership of ACE and the entire higher education community is informed by a career committed to increasing access to high-quality education and improving outcomes for all students. I'll go quickly. He's done so much. He served in the Obama administration as U.S. Undersecretary of Education from 2014 to 2017 and was responsible for all post-secondary education policies when they existed. Before joining the department, he served in a variety of higher education leadership roles, including as president of Occidental College, vice chancellor and dean at UCLA, professor and department chair at Dartmouth, and a member of Stanford's Board of Trustees. Indeed, most importantly, throughout his career, Ted has worked to create an educational system that serves the goals of excellence, equity, and social justice that are so at the heart of Susan's book. So, Ted, the floor is yours. There you are.
Well, Nancy, thank you. Way too much detail. Like all of us, just try to make it work, right? In any way we can. So it's great to be here with a lot of old friends, some new friends, and with this distinguished group, the dynamic duo that's going to help us over the course of the next little bit. I want to start, even before I introduce our panelists, by recognizing that we're in a moment. And I think that we need to remind ourselves that the title of your book is not What Might Have Been. And I want us to approach this conversation as a commitment to this not being a retrospective of things we used to think about, things we used to think were possible, but in fact a recommitment to thinking about this as the way things must be, and the way we will insist in our work together and hold each other accountable for moving forward, not backward. Deal?
Deal.
Deal. All right. So I am not going to read the illustrious histories of my colleagues. I think that you're here because we know and celebrate Susan's work for a very long time, well, for a long time. And we're really, really looking forward to diving in to this book with the recollection of all of the other things that you've done that have really been about thinking about structural change as linked to behavioral change that starts with presence and engagement. And so I hope that we can really dive into that, think about how we can use your examples to challenge ourselves, but also others. Freeman Hrabowski, the ACE Centennial Fellow, which means we only do that once every 100 years. So Freeman will be the Centennial Fellow for 93 more years. And it really is like, yes, I can't tell you how important Freeman has been to ACE, to higher education, certainly to UMBC, to fostering an environment where diversity and equity have been not an afterthought, but the first pillar. Freeman's own history includes a stint in Birmingham jail, as I think you all know, and he talked about that just last month with a group of about 600 college presidents. The question that started that conversation with our presidents was one that you had picked up from your grandson, right?
That's right.
Will we be okay? And eloquently, firmly, decisively, Freeman's answer was, yes, we will be okay. So let's move into the being okay. Why did you write this book?
It's funny you should ask. Is this on? I got a green thing. Okay, can you all hear me okay? Yeah, great. When I was early on in the process, and I actually start the forward this way, I described what I was doing with a then dean of a major law school, not my own, and I told him I was writing a book about how to advance full participation and anti-racism in predominantly white institutions, and he looked at me and said, "Don't write this book." He said, "What are you doing writing this book? This is a terrible idea. You're just going to get yourself in trouble." Right? And I know Earl Lewis says so powerfully, yes, we need to get ourselves into the kind of trouble we need to be able to advance what I call full participation. So I wrote the book also with the encouragement of Nancy and Earl, because I have been working on these issues of how to advance what I call full participation in institutions and communities really for my entire life. And, you know, I think about full participation as something that has to be done not only by an individual, but by a setting, by a group, by an institution, by a community that will make it possible for people, whatever their race, whatever their identity, to be able to enter and thrive and succeed, and importantly, to contribute to the thriving of others. Because my own sense is that people really feel like a full participant when they get to the point where they are sufficiently grounded in a place that they can contribute to others. So I have all this experience trying to do this. I have studied this, I've worked with students, and I know that I've made a lot of mistakes along the way, and I know that I've had to struggle, and I know that I had to learn from my dear friend and collaborator, Lonnie Guinier, that I actually couldn't know fully what the situation was myself, even when I thought I did. And I was willing, at this stage of my career, to be open about the struggles, to do something in describing my own situation that I wouldn't necessarily do for someone else, which is to talk about my missteps, to talk about my struggles, but to think about them as part of the moments of real transformation, both for me and also for the institutions that I was a part of. So what I really wanted to do was to give people who care about issues of race and full participation the tools to be able to do the work, to stay in the work, to have long-term impact, and to bring others into the work as well. And to understand that while this is hard work, and it is a struggle, and there are no easy answers. Anyone who tells you they have an easy answer or the answer, you know that they're not serious about this work. As Freeman knows from having made a lifetime commitment to an institution and to a field, you gotta give it your all. But it's also the most rewarding and joyful work that I have done. The relationships, some of whom are in this room, that I have built, and some of them are on this podium, with people who are in the struggle together, who can do things that I cannot do, is what makes my work so fulfilling and meaningful. So I also wanted to be able to create a platform that would not just say, you have to do this, you can't rely on the people at the top. If you are a person at the top, you have to do this, and you cannot do it yourself. You have to do it by enabling many others in the institution. And if you do that, you will not only learn and grow until you die, you will also create the possibility for joy and meaning in the process of doing the work.
Can I dive a little bit deeper, because I
Please.
think that's...
I'm feeling you might do that.
Yeah, you know. Reading the book and knowing you by reputation, if not in person, we just met a couple days ago, but I've been an avid follower. And one of the things that I have been trying to learn from you is about that paradox of, for white folks, having power and leaning into the having of the power, but surrendering it and involving others in it. How has that journey been for you?
It's been a journey, definitely. When I first started doing this work, really until I had the opportunity to work closely with Lonnie Guinier, I had been working in organizations or with people who were mostly or all white people who were working about race.
Right.
You know, I worked for a special master who was going to transform a prison that was basically largely people of color, and everyone in the special master's office was white. And didn't realize when they went and introduced the special master to a group of predominantly black people that some was going to raise their hand and say, do I have to call you master? None of us had seen that, right? Because we didn't have those eyes. And I'm embarrassed to say it, but it's the truth. And then I worked for...
I was once on a board of overseers.
Yeah. And the same thing happened when I was in law school and then in practice. I did a lot of work doing anti-discrimination, employment discrimination cases, my entire firm, little boutique law firm, again, making these decisions set up by people who had only experienced environments that were set up for and by white people. And so it was only in my 30s when I started working closely with Lonnie, and Lonnie had communities that were multiracial and that were also predominantly non-white, and she invited me in as a collaborator into those communities, and that's where I really had to learn that if I set it up myself, if I thought I had all of the answers, I was going to miss the ways that the setting was actually problematizing the experience, not only for people of color in the setting, but for lots of other people, because actually the people who were watching us were the ones who saw a lot more of what we were doing than we saw ourselves. So I learned over and over and over again, as Nathnal knows and Lauren knows as my students, that I had to leave the idea that I could be the sage on the stage who was going to get everything right, and that I had to hold the space for people, that I have a responsibility, and especially now, to create the centered, calm, engaged grappling with these hard problems, but that I could only do that if I had the people in the room who experienced these issues and these problems firsthand, and if we were able together to say, what is it that I know that I could contribute, which is different than white folks saying, I didn't experience racism, therefore I'm going to keep my mouth shut and not do anything because I don't know. That is not an adequate response for us. That we had to figure out together, what do I know? What can I contribute? What social resources do I have? And where is it that a lot of people who know things I don't know, who have expertise I don't have, who have legitimacy that I could never have, what do they need to be doing? And they need to share the power in order to do that. They can't just be someone who is coming, saying their story, and leaving the room, and then the people who've always had the power are the ones who already make the decisions.
So it's that insistence on using your power to make sure that those voices are in the room, they're recognized. And then the reverse is the gift of grace offered to you to make mistakes in those discussions and to learn from them.
Yes, and I've learned that this is not only something that has to happen at the level of the interaction, but it has to be built into the structure if it's actually going to work. Or there's, a chapter on repurposing power. So Lonnie and I redefined the space of the classroom in a way that I've done with Nathnal, with a person who I work closely with who's formerly incarcerated, where I took responsibility for structuring the space, but we had to share responsibility. But that has to happen not only at the level of the specific classroom, but who gets to decide what a university or an organization is going to prioritize, that those decisions need to be made with those who are the genuine stakeholders of those institutions.
And that's what Freeman does.
Yes, it is.
So Freeman, when you came to UMBC, it wasn't as if there was just a blank canvas. You inherited an institution with a certain set of norms, behaviors, and structures. And from the first, you were committed to the idea of inclusive excellence, of building a community in which people had voice. How did you do that? What were the hard parts about it?
Sure. Let me start by saying that Americans are not accustomed to talking comfortably about racism. And in 2025, right now, we are even more uncomfortable talking about racism. And when we talk about racism, we think of it as a black people's problem. And so for many people who will watch this, they will be taken by the fact that two white people, first of all, are talking about racism, and they will experience it differently while those whites talking about it, and the black person is watching them. Why did the white woman write the book? All right, why is the black guy responding to it? I've known both of them for a long time, and some of my colleagues in the room will know that I've often said the professoriate in this country is primarily white, and that we need colleagues, professors, to understand these issues well, because the student body in our country is no longer primarily white. We all need to understand these issues. We need to understand our history as a country. We still have not grappled with the challenges of slavery. We may think it's that far off, but it is not. We're still grappling with it. And this is why this book is so important right now. But it takes courage to talk about this book when people somehow want us to be neutral about race in our country, when we cannot be neutral about it. It takes courage. And I would suggest this as I talk about UMBC. It is that we must think about our values as Americans, that we believe in our country, and we believe in the richness of the diversity of all of us coming from so many different places, and the worth of our coming from so many different places, and that we are so very, very strong because of coming from so many different places, from Africa to Latin America to Europe to Asia and all of these places, and that it's only by appreciating the differences that we can build on the strength. UMBC was founded at a time, for the first time in our country, when people of all races could go to the same institution in the 60s. For the most part, before that, people went to institutions of their type only. And what's significant about that is that for the first time at UMBC, we had blacks coming to an institution that was still predominantly white. And by the time I got there, 20 years later in the 80s, the major challenge was that while some students were succeeding, students were not succeeding in the sciences. And so some people were very bothered because black students were not succeeding in the sciences. What they didn't know was that white students were not succeeding either. So black students called the place racist, and whites just said it was cold, very cold. But when we looked at the data, what we found was that most students weren't succeeding. And what I knew, having come from a large graduate institution in the Midwest, the University of Illinois, was that white students were not succeeding in the country in sciences. And even today, we find, as I say in my TED Talk, that large percentages of students of all races do not succeed in science. And this gets to the point that's made in the book about this idea of this linked destiny, somehow fate, linked fate, as we call it, that it's not, that we may see one group, and it's interesting when we talk about that canary and the idea that you see the tip of the iceberg when you see minority students not succeeding, and it turns out many other students are not succeeding. When you look, you see that the majority of students don't succeed in science in our country. We call those courses, according to NSF, weed out courses somehow. And that's the point that I would make about our Meyerhoff Scholars Program at UMBC. The fact is that we have a lot of work to do in helping many more students succeed You can learn things from students of color, students from underrepresented populations, first-generation college students, that can help many students. And that's what we see in general, not just in the sciences, that almost half of the students in our country who start in college don't succeed. And we see that in all kinds of 2- and 4-year institutions. And the challenge we face, it seems to me, and the book talks about it, is that we don't take the time to disaggregate data, to understand what's happening with Black students, Latino students, rural students, urban students, and then to use what we find to help all those groups, and to understand the prejudices that we have, whether about class or race or sexuality, all these different prejudices that work against people, and that we need to take the time, quite frankly, to have the hard conversations. Something we did at UMBC that made a big difference, and that we're saying now we have to do this, and more now than ever.
So the Meyerhoff program, clearly a pioneering program, the pioneering program in working on achievement levels for
Yes,
Black
yes,
students in the sciences.
yes.
Pushback?
Pushback, and in those first years, people didn't think it could be done. We had not shown in the country that Black students in a predominantly white university could excel, so much so that they could go on and get PhDs in science and engineering. And we became the leading institution in the country of all types to go on and have students completing PhDs in science and engineering, and we remain that today. But most important, we're able to show that the tactics we were using, the strategies we were using, could be used by institutions of all kind, and that those strategies could be replicated by other institutions, and not just in science and engineering. That's the point. And that's the point we would make now, that it should be about inclusion and about the idea that if you work on helping more students to succeed, and you work with faculty on strategies for inclusion, that we can do a much better job. And that's the point we'd make in higher education generally, that we can help many more students, students from rural backgrounds, first-generation college students, and that those same strategies can be used to help all types of students, including right now, white males who have started going to college at much lower percentages than before. We know the group in America right now, same idea. And that's that idea of linked, that idea that we have to keep thinking about the fate of every group as we think about helping Americans to succeed.
So you both talked about remaking the classroom. and we all know that faculty embrace change rapidly and effectively. Sorry, thank you. I was worried that I was maybe going to persuade some people, but no.
But Ted, just as one other comment, I do want to say this, that this is a time when we in higher education and we in the larger society should think about how much progress we either have made or have not made in our society when thinking about what the book talks about, full participation. And the fact is that we have a long way to go. Whether talking about for women or Blacks, Latinos, or poor kids, poor children of all types, all you have to do is look at the NAEP data, the academic skills of our children, and the fact that the bottom half cannot read well. Or you look at what's happening, whether it's on corporate boards or on in the professoriate, that you do not have large numbers or percentages of people from these underrepresented groups in those rooms. And so while we had begun some steps and we were beginning to make some progress, that this is the time when we can all, as a society, not just in higher education, look in the mirror to say, what do we need to do to improve, to have the full participation? And that's the patriotic thing to do. That's what I would say. We all believe in America, and we want America to be as strong as possible. We believe in the talent from all groups, and we need to talk about that.
Looking at NAEP data, what a quaint idea.
The importance of education, the Department of Education, the centrality of education. Where would any of us be without an education, not just for the privileged, but for poor children in our country? I mean, that's the value of our country, is we've always believed that we want to take the least of them and lift them up, those first-generation people. And that fits so well with the book when we talk about, because it's about prejudice and about getting over that to help full participation of everyone.
So this is where, it's exactly where I'd like to head, because faculty come into a classroom with a lot of preconceived ideas about who is out there. and what they are capable of. How do you even start that conversation about all students can succeed with faculty who have been in predominantly white institutions? They have come with all of the trappings, not only of white privilege, but of major research university privilege, all of which says, I know and you don't. How do you start to change that?
Well, I want to ground this in the observation that there are these contradictions that we cannot avoid, that we can't think only about race because science students failed more generally. But if we don't think about race, we're going to leave the students of color behind. And by the way, we might not even be able to learn the way that the institution is failing. So we have to figure out how to ask the question in a way that is both, what do you care about as a teacher, and how do you make sure that everyone in your classroom and in your institution is succeeding. We can reframe the question about racism in a way that asks, how does our ability to succeed as teachers, as higher education institutions, which is really on the line right now, how do we need to reframe in ways that will think about how we are interconnected? And so that's one of the things that I think all of the examples in the book, and Meyerhoff is a prime one, found a way to both keep the question of race relevant because you could not actually achieve the goal of full participation without considering race, and you could not actually achieve your mission in a democratic country without achieving full participation. So you could reframe the question of why are our black students failing to be the question about how do we need to teach science so that everyone in your class can succeed, and how can you start thinking about your students' failures as your failures rather than a way to rank order the people who were successful. And then how do we start thinking about doing this in a way that we will understand what we don't know, which I could not have understood if I didn't start working with people who would tell me what I didn't know, who would actually help me see that I only saw a part of the picture, and then help me create spaces where I would learn that not only from my colleagues, but also from my students. And then I think another really important thing, so I've talked about 3 strategies for holding these paradoxes, the one that Nancy talked about, that we have to both talk about race and not talk about race. We have to lean into our responsibilities as people who are leading, while we're also stepping back and creating space and redefining power for the people who are not currently part of the power structure and need to be at the table. And we need to think about how we're going to work within these institutions, but create the space for pushing those institutions to fundamentally transform. Well, how are we going to do that from the vantage point of a faculty member? I think we have to think about this as a long-term process that requires taking small steps towards large goals. So I think faculty members are petrified because I see this with my own colleagues. They don't know how to do this. They don't know how to do this. And they're so worried that if they try and they mess up, then they're going to be on the front page of some media or lambasted in some social media, and that something that will do damage to either their reputation or even to their job. So there's so much fear now attached to trying things. So I think part of what we need to do is scale down the scope of what someone is trying to do as an individual and scale up our ambition of what we're trying to do as an institution and as a society. So you are not the only one who's responsible for doing this, faculty member. We're going to help you. We're going to create spaces where you can have these conversations, where you can learn, build the capacity to do this, and where if you fail, we're going to try to set it up so that we can all learn from that. And I know this can happen because I've experienced it. I know it can happen. And then if you're held then in that space where you can try these things, and then we can learn from them, we can build across institutions, we can do this is what Meyerhoff did, so what what Freeman did so powerfully with Meyerhoff is it started with black boys, and then it included black girls. And then when the court said, you can't do this only about race, did that mean it was going to stop? No. What it meant was we're going to figure out what it is that we're trying to do that it will benefit everyone, that will also really enable us to have black boys and girls succeed. And then did we stop with STEM? No. Then we actually moved to women, and we moved to issues of the humanities, and we moved to issues of student governance. So one thing built onto the next, where you now have an institution that is reflecting the values that started out in Meyerhoff. We have to learn from that process, and that means we got to learn how to stick with this over the long haul.
It really does mean, first of all, in terms of leadership, and I say this in one of our books on leadership and empowerment, that it doesn't start with one person. I'm always saying, and my sister president Nancy would appreciate this, that it's not about the one leader. It is about the faculty and other colleagues, that it is about people taking on to a vision of what you want to do. Because you can't get things done without faculty leaders working together to get something done. And not just faculty in the sciences, but in the humanities and the social sciences, believing in those students to say you can get it done. And what I would tell you is this, that there are, and you know this, not just at UMBC, but on campuses, there are faculty who work to make a difference, to change attitudes. And when I think about your book and these prejudices that we see as we think about race and all the other factors, all the other groups that we talk about, whether in the Middle East or wherever we're talking about right now, that we have to find ways to help people to learn to talk across differences. Right now in our society, whether they're political differences or parts of religion or whatever the issues, and there are certain fundamental, seems to me, values and principles we have to talk about. One of those is humility. That the fact is that we are so quick to draw a conclusion and say, I'm right and you're wrong. And there's this need for a willingness to keep asking questions and to try to hear the other perspective, it seems to me, more than ever. And for us as leaders to learn how we work in classrooms and beyond classrooms to help our students do a better job than our generation has done in listening to each other as Americans right now. We are so divided when talking about these issues that we can't hear each other, not just across race, but across so many factors. And I would hope that your book and others can help us to sit and have the conversations. There is a saying that those the gods wish to destroy, they first make angry. We cannot have productive conversations if we simply become angry. Got to be able to stop and calmly think about the issues and hear the other perspective.
It's going to be your turn in just a minute. So think about those questions. But
I just want to repeat something that I heard at the Beyond the Bars conference a couple of weeks ago from a woman whose name is Imani Davis, whose father was incarcerated at one point, whose brother was incarcerated. And we were talking about, there was a group of people who were in a panic, honestly, as many people are, right? And she said, I have high standards and expectations. And she said, I am seeking the calm. She actually talked about herself as a yelder, a young elder. Young elder. She was 46. I'm like, okay, you really are a young elder. But what she talked about is that at this particular moment, when we are in this state of high anxiety and crisis, that so many people, including so many people in leadership positions for very understandable reasons, are really in a reactive state, in a state of just complete panic. And we know when we're in that state that we can't listen and that we can't think. And also, the people who are going to inherit this world, the people who are the up-and-coming generations, they're going to take their cues from how we respond to being in a situation of profound challenge. And so I'm not suggesting, nor is Freeman suggesting, that that means that we turn away from the challenges that we're facing, but rather that we stay centered, that we take the long view, and that we really ask the question, how are we going to find the points of connection that are meaningful, that will really make it urgent? And this is not just in higher ed. You know, we saw this, the book also deals with the theater industry, and the book deals with the legal system and the judicial system. And people who care about justice, people who care about the rule of law, are profoundly affected by the fact that this is a system that evidence demonstrates systematically disadvantages people of color, and that many people of many different races experience justice as anything but just, and humanity as anything but humane. So we have to find a way to stay centered in those values and to say, yes, there are people who are going to get hurt, and we're going to do the very best we can to protect people, but we are in this for the long haul. We are going to stay centered and calm, and we're going to make it possible for us to make mistakes, make it possible for us to struggle together, make it possible for us to have joyful struggle. And this is a message that I think is really easy to lose in this particular moment, but it's something we build by building community after community after community that is engaged in on-the-ground work that then connects to each other so that it has a kind of cascading effect. And that's why I keep coming back to the way this was done over a 25-year period at UMBC. We need to have that picture in mind, the long view. I talk about zooming in and zooming out. Yeah. We zoom out to see the systemic challenges that we are facing and the ways in which we are all interconnected. We identify a space where we can zoom in and say, I can create a microspace of justice here that can hold those tensions while feeling a sense of calm, even as we are deeply uncomfortable and maybe even pessimistic. And I can hold that space of hope while I also engage in this kind of struggle, because what else are we going to do? If we don't do that, we know we won't hold on to the institutions we care. We know we won't hold on to the democratic values that are so important. We know we will stay in a place we have never realized what a racially just community is, and we need to keep working at that.
Susan, I just have to say, the book gives us hope. I said to my grandson that we're homeschooling. He's 13, and he's listening to the news, and he keeps saying, "Papa, will we be okay?" And I'm saying, son, when I was your age, I was sitting in jail with Dr. King asking, are we going to be okay? And I know from history, the importance of history, that we're going to be okay, because we're going to keep fighting for justice. We're going to do this. I believe in our country, and I want you to believe in our country. We've got a lot of work to do, but we're going to be okay. And that's what leaders have to keep saying to our young people, that we're going to keep struggling through this and understanding this and using our brain power and not panic, and we'll be okay.
And we have to create the space. I feel like at this stage of my life, my job is to create the space for the people I see around this room to be the ones who are going to take up that mantle. Right. And I see them doing it. If you create the space where they can share the power, then they will do it. And I think some of us need to, I'm not saying get out of the way, but we need to, that's the sharing power idea, right? It's not only about race, it's also generational and disciplinary, that we need to create the space for the people who are going to inherit what we hope will be not quite the mess it is now, to be able to step into those kinds of roles.
And I think one of the things, I talk to a lot of college presidents on a day-to-day basis these days, and one of the things that's very interesting is that there's a small but really important group of them who understand that if we're confused about all of this, their students are horribly confused about all of this. Mm-hmm. And using that actually as an opening to create a space and, as we used to say, problematizing the current situation as a way of getting into it, and getting people out of their corners of where they might have been and just say, this is weird, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And then starting that conversation. And then I think where your experience and your leadership and the book guide us is toward creating those spaces and then building structures that reinforce the existence of those spaces and help them migrate from wherever they might start into other areas. And I think that I want to ask you at the very end, where do we go from here? But I think I've just heard you both say something like that. Questions for you all? We could do this all afternoon, and I know we don't have time, but we do have time for a couple of questions or comments.
Don't be shy.
Do not be.
And if we think about this as, this may be just being, I cannot constitutionally stay in a place of only despondency and despair. I have to face up to the situation we're feeling and experiencing, but also find, like, where are the openings? And so this is not about this book per se, or this book series, which is so amazing, or about this amazing leader who's so transformational. This is about all of us. This is part of what I hope is the message of the book, is that we are all change agents. We all have a role to play. We need the people who are fighting. We need the people who are weaving. We need the people who are dreaming. We need the people who are researching. So if you have a chance to, if you're just thinking about it, like, what would you like us together to be moving toward as you think about this? What does this make you think about in your own spheres or your own lives, that, or some question that you have, like, no, that won't work, this is really an invitation for you to share that, or to push back, or to question, but we do really want to build from this. We don't want this to be a book on a shelf or a leader who holds all of the cards, but rather a way in which we are all going to have to pull together in new ways to take responsibility for democracy and for our institutions. So any thoughts that you have?
Hi, I don't know if this is on. I just want to thank you for an incredibly inspiring talk. I have 2 children, one of whom is an activist and has been kicked out of her institution for nonviolent protests. It was involving the recent, Israel-Palestine. And she and her twin brother, who's also extremely involved politically, feel that our generation, and we're all pretty close in age, have failed them, and also that by and large many of the major academic institutions who are so terrified on a higher level of what is happening in the federal government has failed them. So I want to be a leader for my twins, who I admire so much, and for other young people, but how do we do this when they're in a very negative feeling now about their colleges, their other leaders?
You start now, go ahead.
Well, first of all, I just want to say that I feel your pain as a parent, as someone who is looking at a struggle that you did not want your children to have, while you're also so proud of their courage and their values and their principles. And I just think that's a first starting place for this, is for us to acknowledge the human impact of this. I'm working with someone who was a legal observer and is deathly afraid of, not a U.S. citizen, is deathly afraid that she's not going to be able to finish her graduate education because she's going to be named. And I see it on her face in every interaction that we have. So I think the first step in all of this is not to push too quickly to action, but to give people who have been harmed in some way that's deeply profound a space to have real caring for them as people. And what does that mean? Now, when the reason they experience the harm is because they care so deeply about something public, it's not enough to focus on this only as individuals. And so this is where I think asking questions to me, can we engage with a real inquiry about what we are facing now, and ask the question knowing that institutions are in the crosshairs. This is the paradox of, they're in the crosshairs of being threatened with their very existence, at the same time that if they don't act, they are threatening the existence of the people they are responsible for. And both of those things are true. So I think that paradox, I find, can be helpful as a way to at least create a possibility for some dialogue. And then I've been really asking questions. What would you want of us, who, given this is the position we're in? And then how can we come together to try to grapple with the differences in the way we're understanding the moment we're in? Let's think forward. Let's think where we want to be, not just in this moment, but where do we want to be a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now? And I think that's something that often we know what we hate, we know what we don't want, we know what has injured us, but it's really hard for us to say, what is it that we really want? What is the institution that we really want to see? So if we can engage, first we have to see, are you ready to go there? And if not, how can we support you? And then if you're ready to go there, how do we have a conversation where we can say, what could we build that would look different? And what's your part in that? And how can we sustain you outside of these institutions, because you're not throwaway people just because you have now been separated from a major institution? How can we find ways to support you so that you can continue to push for long-term full participation?
Just two comments. Number one, thank you for being a caring parent. Thank you for that. I feel you, okay? Your children feel you. They know that you care. There's nothing you can do that's more important than to let them know how special they are to you. Just keep doing that. They're going to be okay when they've got a mother like that, right? Because you want to help them get beyond the anger and the cynicism. That's a part, and I get that. When Bull Connor died, I've told this story many times, he had been so mean to me and throwing me in the police wagon and spitting on me. When he died, my mother called me, and she was crying. And she said, police commissioner died. And I said, Mama, why are you crying? And she said, because he was somebody's child. And he never had somebody to tell him it was wrong to hate people. And before I knew it, she had me crying. I was in college. She had me crying. And I released all the hatred I'd had for years, because she'd always said, don't hate the person, hate what he did, don't hate him, because it was consuming me. And I didn't even realize. I had a big afro at that time, this was, and all of that, right? But it was consuming me. I didn't realize how much it was consuming, that hatred for him, right? And I released it. And I'm saying to you what a loving mother can do for children. And you will help them to get me. That's the one. And then the other one is another kind of comment, and Ted will appreciate this, Nancy will appreciate this, that it's really hard to be a leader in America, right, in the world right now. And I was working with a college president last night who's just leaving the position. Because regardless of what a leader does, or a college president, leader, half the people are gonna be unhappy, whatever that person does right now. Because some will see the person is doing the right thing, the others will not. Because we all have a point of view. And it's never simple in these things. And I think part of what I'm saying as an old guy now is we have to find a way to help us all to be more humble and wise enough to try to see it from both points of view as we figure out the best thing to do or the better thing to do between the two. And what the book talks about is the complexity of holding two things and the tension there. That's what makes it so complicated somehow, when you've got to hold these things in your mind at the same time. And it takes time and experience to be able to deal with the complexity of all of this. But going back to the first thing I said, the love you have for your children will see them through more than anything else. It really will. Okay. Yeah. There's one over there.
Couple hands up.
Hi, I'm Erica. I'm an associate at ACE, and I'm starting graduate school this fall, and I totally hear what you say about creating space, but as a young person, I don't necessarily feel like that. So I guess I'm wondering how you would, any advice you'd have for young people in finding that space and using it to the best of your ability with whatever strengths and knowledge you're bringing to the table.
I love the question, both because of the humility in the question and also because you are claiming space of agency. You know, what can I do? To understanding that when you come in as a new graduate student or as a new law student, it doesn't look like you don't have a lot of formal power, right? I will say that some of the most transformative spaces that I have seen in higher ed have been created by students. And particularly when students create a space where they get faculty members or staff who fully understand what they're trying to do and are willing to lend their wisdom to the creation of these spaces that are in fact sustainable and that are in fact deeply inquisitive and self-reflective, without taking over those spaces so that it doesn't recreate the power dynamic which makes you feel like you don't have anything to say, and also so that it fully reflects the perspective of these multiple generations and these multiple points of view. And so what I would say is, first of all, you know, just start with yourself. I mean, it's the little version of the same thing, like you're gonna find your people, and I don't have to tell you that, but I'm looking around the room and I know that part of what was really important was to find a couple of other people who share your values. They don't have to agree with you, but who share your values and wanna work on things together, right? Where you can actually come together. And then find something that you really want to do, and then find some people who have positions of responsibility so that they can bring resources and space to you and have them support what it is that you are trying to do. And I would say that, especially right now, and like your job, in my view, and I'd be very interested what Freeman thinks about this and what Nancy and Earl think about this as well. Your job, you're there for a relatively short period of time. You're not the ones who have to fundamentally transform these institutions. We are the long-termers in these institutions. It's our responsibility to make these changes, but we can't do it without your insight and support. But I would say keep the long view about why you're there. You're there because you want to go out into the world and be transformational and do your work and do what you need to do to equip yourself to be able to do that. And if you do that, as I look around the room and I see people who have done that, you're also going to transform the space that you're in, but you're going to transform it in a way that also enables your long-term needs and interests to be taken care of. And so I would say on your question, you can be not only hopeful, but you can be optimistic. Because I have never been in an institution of higher education or a court system where there weren't at least a few people who would want to sign on completely to what you want to do. And to do what you're talking about, you don't need the person at the top. It'd be nice if it was the person at the top. You need someone who's going to create the space, and then from that space you can push out, push out, push out, so that space gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
Excellent point. I'm always telling students and young faculty, be the best you can, first of all, in your academic disciplines. To take the time, whether just people in general, work to be the best thinker you can, to really get that respectability in your discipline, and to be involved in civic engagement. I'm always interested in people understanding the bigger world, the challenges, and how whatever you're doing, whatever the discipline, whether it's in the humanities and social sciences, arts, or in the sciences, how whatever you're going to be doing connects to the big problems of the world somehow. And you can always have some time where you're helping, whether it's in tutoring or looking at the big issues involved, and looking at the world itself. That's why I think when we think about our institutions and we think about the fact that people want to say somehow that we are detached from the larger world, no. Institutions are working to solve problems right now in different ways, and it's not just one select group of institutions. No, our comprehensives, community colleges, minority serving, Latino, Hispanic serving, HBCUs, places are working right now to solve the problems of humankind, of their communities, right where they sit, and other institutions, and we need to be marketing and talking about that to the public more as we find the language and teach our students how to use language that helps people who've not had the benefit of education to learn the importance of education. I can't say that enough. 2/3 of Americans have not had the benefit of what we give in higher education. And that fits so well when we think about discrimination and prejudice. Those of us who've had the benefit of education have so much to offer as we think about pulling more into this work, even as we think about ways in which people are discriminated against. It's so important that we talk about that.
Can I add an editorial comment from the moderator's chair? I think, clearly all of that's right. One of the things that I think a lot about is scale and scaling.
Yeah.
And I think that somehow we've gotten the idea that something isn't working unless it's really big. And so in thinking about the work that we've done together at ACE, the work that you're going to do, I would encourage all of us to be comfortable with a scale that fits. And so if you don't feel like you've done anything until the president says, we're going to do this and there's going to be a center for the study of whatever, it's not going to get what we're talking about, because what we're talking about is something that's far more personal. It's far more interactive in a long and generative way. And I think moving it circularly in widening circles is a much better way to think about it than I'm going to have an idea. This is the classical entrepreneur. I'm going to have an idea. It's going to be the best idea in the world. No one's going to get in my way. I'm going to make it really big, and at the end, I will dominate the universe. Well, he's proving that he can't. But my point is, don't rush the kind of community development that we're really talking about here.
And Ted can really speak to the power of intermediary institutions to help us that connective tissue, which I think is so important, because we might lose some of the institutions that are currently providing that kind of connective tissue. And I think that's part of what we all need to be doing when I think about moving. And we've talked about mapping our relationships, but a place like ACE, an institution like ACE really could be helpful. Like, you have this amazing connection, so if you figure out a way to do something, maybe that will connect to some people who are in another graduate school who could communicate with you, and you learn about that, and then you become more of a community. And so when an issue presents itself that affects you, you've got 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 graduate school students that have built little communities that can all come together when the issue presents itself. And we need places like ACE, and those of us that are trying to create linkages across institutions, so that you don't have to be the one to do all that connective tissue that is needed to support this at an architectural level, and not just at the level of institution.
Exactly. And if I can just play with that for just a moment. Thank you. Right before we started, ACE had an open conversation with members and others in the field. This is the 4th one we've had since Inauguration Day. First one we had 1,500 people on the call. Second one, we had 3,000 people on the call. The third one, we had 7,000 people on the call, and the Zoom link crashed.
Wow.
Today, there were 4,000 people on the call.
Wow.
So there are two ways now to think about that, right? The empire builder would say, great, all of these people are connected to ACE, and we're going to give them the truth. I see this as 1,000, 3,000, 5,000, 7,000 opportunities for people to find each other. Mm-hmm. And so for me, sure, words came out of my mouth, blah, 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 but the chat was what I wanted to see. And I loved seeing people can you, after a comment or a question, can you share your information? Yeah. You know, so I think that that's the way that we can think about this, not in a traditional scale up, scale out, but creating pods of people, networks of pods, right?
I just have one thing. I made a big mistake today, and I need to admit it. I talked about NAEP data. Most people in America don't have a clue of what I said. If you're in DC, you're used to acronyms, all right? Or if you're in education. That has to do, NAEP data, I'm talking about education test scores. What I should have said was that a large percentage of our children in this country across the races are not reading or computing at grade level. That's so much simpler. And I'm going to make that point to say this, that we in education sometimes talk in a way that regular people may not understand what we're saying. And I need to say that because people say we can be elitist, and it's true. I think I'm a regular guy. I go around the country talking to people of all types, and yet I'm saying to us in higher education, we have to look in the mirror and ask the question, how can we be clearer in how we say things to people? And I'm saying, as we think about our Department of Education in this country, that we in higher education should be as concerned about pre-K through 12 as we are about what happens at the PhD level. Because we can't talk about issues of prejudice and racism if we don't talk about whether our children can read. Because if they can't read, they can never go to college. And so we have to feel connected on those kinds of issues.
Sorry, we were getting carried away here. Please.
Thanks. This is actually a question that ties to some of the language and some of what you've already said. My name's Jen. I lead a national program called the All In Campus Democracy Challenge. I've had the pleasure to work with and know all of you over time. I thank you for your book and this conversation, which is super important. It was also, it came out a month-ish ago. It was clearly written in a different moment. We're in a very specific moment right now. And, as someone, when you said the word Yelder before, Susan, I kind of identified as another kind of 46-year-old in that and in this kind of interconnected space. But I think, I realize as a white woman, I have responsibilities for helping to unravel white supremacy, for helping to advance anti-racism. I do that work at the intersection with over 1,000 campuses in terms of thinking about civic and democratic engagement. And that's really important. And yet we're at the moment where in some states, I'm going to put aside the DC portion of this for a moment, they can't use some of this language that we're talking about, right? And it's hamstringing not only the presidents, but the faculty who want to talk about these issues. They're undoing a lot of effort with these anti-DEI laws, with changing what we can talk about in curriculum and higher education, and again, setting aside some of the executive orders and other pieces. And I just wonder, from all of you, really, as we situate this work that we all know in this room, and I'm guessing on, the live stream or whatever needs to happen, what recommendations you have, what thoughts you have as you've talked to other people about language we need to use, about how we continue to do the work, not only locally, but kind of at scale, as we grapple with the need to fight racism and all sorts of other isms, and also in some ways can't always talk about it in the spaces where we need to, in those classrooms, in those communities. And so I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
Why don't we use that as a prompt for the sort of last question of where do we go from here? Is that right? Thanks.
I always want to hear the rest of the questions. So if anyone else has a question, just feel free to come up afterwards because I think the questions are just so important. I will, just in response to that question, I would say, first of all, no one has an answer to that, right? So I don't want to claim to have an answer. These are really hard problems. Part of the reason I like the language of full participation is that of course you can, because how do you object to the language of belonging? And we found a way to do that too. But full participation is a value that seems so cross-cutting, And if you're really serious about full participation and you ask questions along the lines of some of the questions that are posed in the book, and that were posed by the people who I document in the book, you're going to get, especially if you think about it in the present day, you think about it historically, you think about it in terms of where you want to go, you're going to have to engage with issues of race. And people in places where I think it's so important that we not do anticipatory protectionism. I think we do need to keep talking about race. And I understand in states where, I don't think any state has said you cannot use the word, right? But people are jumping to that conclusion that you cannot even use the word. Of course, there's a list of words that the federal government says you're not supposed to use, but that is not law. It's not law, but it's scary because we have this coming from guidance from. So I think it's really important to ground what we're doing in something that lots of people care about, that lies at the intersection of concerns about race and concerns that are broader than that. And that sounds like it's avoiding the issue. And in another time when I used the language of full participation, I got a lot of criticism as a white woman using the language of full participation. Are you sidestepping race? And people would respond to my using the word differently, I would guess, than they might if Freeman were using the word differently, using the language of full participation. But now, even then, full participation, if it's meaningful, means you're asking that question for everyone who's in the larger community who has a claim on that space. And that means you've got to be asking that question and understanding what are the patterns that are enabling people to fully participate and not. And we can ask this about what it means to have a meaningful education. We can ask it around what does it mean to experience the legal system as just. We can ask the question about whether the culture and theater is actually representing the stories and the challenges that are important to the people in our larger communities. Every one of those spaces is one where full participation is an issue. But I would say I don't want to say this is the answer, because there is no answer to this language question. What we need to do is come together around a set of values that say, you know what, everyone in this space matters. And how do we, if this is our goal, education, and everyone in this space matters, how do we need to go forward? And so if we can, we have to find out the way we can have that conversation, and whenever we can, I think we have to say, and that means we have to ask questions about race and about gender and about sexual, all of the ways in which people can be marginalized or excluded. And when I think about this moment that we're in, I think that it's really important for people like me to I would say, level up. And I don't mean by that try to make national policy, but I've been doing this work for my entire life. No one could say to me, oh, you've just advanced your career, because this is what I care about, right? But I have been working in my own space, in my own classrooms, in my own institution, in my own writing, and I have not really taken the responsibility of saying, how does this connect to what it means to be part of this larger polity and to have an impact at this in this larger way? And I think every one of us who cares about these questions needs to be saying, what is my role in this? How do I connect to others who can support me in doing this work? How can I be in it for the long haul? And how am I going to enlist the institutions that are willing to help us stay the course, stay connected. And that is, we have to be willing to do that in a way that is uncomfortable, where we're going to make mistakes, where conflict is not a bad thing unless the conflict is to have war on others so that to shut them down. That conflict is essential to this work, and that we have to build the relationships and the muscle and the institutional support to be able to do that work. So we can do this. It will be hard. There are going to be costs. It's not going to be smooth, but if every one of the people who has been relatively silent, who said, I can't do this because I don't know. I can't do this because I'm only a professor. I can't do this because I'm a judge and I just call balls and strikes. I can't do this because I'm a director and what do we know about these larger questions? Every one of those people, and we can keep going, I'm just a student. Students, we all have a way of doing this work, and we can't do it alone, but we can't do it unless every one of us who cares about these issues steps up in that way. And so that's what I think we're in. And if we do this, I would say we've never done this. We've always left the decisions, because we've been asked to people who are supposed to represent us and often have not. And so now we have to make democracy happen.
Two quick points. Geography clearly matters. I am in Baltimore. Maryland, Baltimore, we would call the Upper South. We have a black governor, right? Very different situation. We know that, right? But I am from Alabama. I am very pleased that the schools, that for the first time, fourth grade math, doing better than most of the country. Improvement, we're seeing it, and people are talking about it. But, and I've said this to Susan, I would not use the language, some of the language in the book, but when I'm talking to legislators in the Deep South, and with my own books on resilience and empowerment, there is language that I can use that people will hear that will involve the fact that people are concerned that white males are not going to college at the same levels. They're not going to the military. They're not getting jobs in factories. They are getting into trouble. And some of the strategies we may be using to help them in school will be the same ones that can help my black children and other people for full participation that she talks about. And I can say to a fellow legislator who's my age, I'm talking about your grandson, okay? Was working with rural Pennsylvania last week, and a very courageous white male history teacher wanted me to convince his children in the school that the civil rights movement was important to them, not just to blacks and women. And I told the story of speaking to the Georgia School Board Associations, and people seemed to be a little uncomfortable when the head of one of the school boards of one of the counties got up and said, I'm the head of my school board association, and I'm the head of a company, and I'm rich. And you assume that I came from money, but my dad died, and we were poor. And we saw the little Negro children going off to college in the 70s, their mother, because of the Pell Grant. And my mother said, my mama wanted us to go to college because of the Civil Rights Act and the Higher Education Act. And so he said this to the whole group. So when you hear people talking about the Civil Rights Act, don't think it's just for blacks and women. It was for little poor white boys too. It's for all of us, right? Now, he never talked about racism, but he was saying that Civil Rights Act was for all of America and took us from the under 10% higher education up to a third. So there's language we can use to talk about getting more people included, to open minds and hearts, and that is what we must do.
So I lied. That wasn't the last question. Please.
Okay. Thank you all for being here and for the book. I think this was said earlier, making sure that we hear the other side out, or at least like try to, put in the effort to do that and have humility. And I understand that. I think like that's sort of how I lived a lot of my years, but what do we do when the other side is just not playing fair? Like for example, with the Palestine protest at Columbia, at my school, we're seeing one side in particular get doxxed and their identities being disclosed to everybody around the world. We're seeing the case of Mahmoud, being detained and having his freedom of expression stripped. But even in the racial lens, when we're talking about DEI, right? Like one side wants to get rid of DEI altogether and wants to get rid of the Department of Education, which I know we talked about earlier, is important, especially for kids. So like what do we do in those instances when we can hear the other side out, but they're simply not doing that for us?
I'll go after you. You want to go? Okay, sure. I had the same conversation with a group of students at a college recently. We certainly don't give up, and we know it's wrong, all right? And we have to think through strategy that can make a difference. And this is when I talk about playing chess, not checkers. In other words, just moving quickly will not be the answer. That we have to look at strategies. And one of those strategies has to do with teaching students how civic engagement also means what the roll call the whole vote. That we have opportunities to work with elected officials on policies in our country that can make a difference in the way our nation moves, all right? And it doesn't mean that things change immediately. It does take time to make a change. I had the privilege of studying in the Middle East 50 years ago and looking deeply into the issues involving the Middle East. And one of the things I learned was the more I learn about both sides, the more I realize there are no simple answers, that it's extremely complicated, and it's going to take a lot to come to some resolution, that there's no right and wrong, and that a lot has to be done. And it's going to take time to work through it somehow. And it will not be happening quickly. That's not an answer to you, but it is a matter that we have to keep working on it together to make something happen. But a quick move won't make a difference.
And this won't surprise you, Ethno, but there's all this talk about having difficult conversations, but having a difficult conversation with someone who's ready to cut your head off is probably not a good idea, right? That we have to really assess whether, and I think we should have a presumption in favor of having those conversations. But if we have tried and we have a sense that if by speaking the only thing that will happen is you'll be giving ammunition to someone who really does not want to be in dialogue with you, that basically wants to push you out, then you have to acknowledge, especially if they have the power, in those situations, you can't change what they do. But I think in this situation, part of what is problematic is if we are going to define what in reaction to that only defensively and being activated by an injustice that we experience, then we are risking replicating the very thing we're trying to change because we're only in reactive mode. And so to me, the question is, in a situation where you are persuaded that we can't hear both sides, we're not in a situation of really trying to figure out how to bridge this unbridgeable gap, then we have to create spaces where we can have those conversations in the short run. We have to continue to build the connective tissue that will keep those people who've been pushed out safe, and that will also keep the values alive that you're talking about. So when the tide shifts, we haven't let go of the institutional structures that make it possible to do exactly what you're talking about. And so this is discernment, right? This is discernment that we have to really, I think we have to err on the side of having the conversation. We have to err on the side of being in the conflict. But if we've gotten our head bashed in over and over again, and there is a sense that this is not, we're not in this together, and that's been made absolutely clear, then I don't think the response is necessarily go to war. I think the response is let's build what we have to build in order to be in the position where when we can return to a sense of real democratic participation, we have many, many, many more people who are ready to do that work, who are eager to do that work, and will fight for that work. It's not a very, neither one of these are satisfying. They're not satisfying, but they are, in fact, not defeatist either. You know, like we can't give up, and this is not a time, I think, when we can only rely on our ways of, my book says, how do we get institutions into this that don't want to do it? Well, sometimes we need outside pressure, we need litigation, we need protest to get to the point. Well, what if none of that works? We have to still do the work of building institutions and people that stay connected to these values so that we have that cadre ready as soon as it can have an impact on the broader conversation.
The book talks about racism. Those of us who've lived 70 years continue to see children of any race who are poor, without opportunities, who die early, all right? And yet we are still with hope that we can make it better. It won't happen today, but we're committed to it and are committed to producing leaders like you who will be committed to it. It takes time. It takes a lot of time, but we've seen the downside, and you have to just have that commitment that we can make a difference. We keep working at it, not to jump to do something that's not going to make a difference. Got to figure out what we can do, the kinds of approaches that she talks about. But I want to commend you for your passion and for your belief. Okay.
And with passion and belief is the right way for us to end today. So hats off to you. Thank you for that. Thank you for the recommitment that I feel us all making to these issues this afternoon. And Susan, thank you so much for writing the book.
Susan, sir.
A round of applause. And Freeman, my mentor and friend, thank you for being with us today and for all that you have done to show us the way.